This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to tonight's Storyworks Roundtable. We've got Mike Stop Continues back on the show tonight to talk about literary fiction. So if you missed it, make sure you go back through the episodes and find our conversation about foreshadowing. There are actually two parts. The first one where we had some open ends, and the second one where we had Mike on to help us find clarity on the issue. Mike is the author of Underworld and the King Cage Superheroes series. Welcome back, Mike.
Thanks.
Yeah, good to have you back, Mike.
Yay. So, literary fiction. Let's start with a conversation about what it is. So a little while ago, I posted a thread in a Facebook group asking people what they thought of the term literary fiction, whether or not they read it, whether or not the term left them a bad taste in their mouth. And I was shocked at the vitriol that came up. It seems a lot of people, a lot of indie writers, because this was an indie writer group, really don't like the word literary and had some bad feelings about literary fiction. So Mike and I both write in literary genre, literary fiction, as well as other genres. Catherine and Robert, I know you guys read every genre. You probably write literary stuff as well, would you say?
I have in the past, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, not me. But I read the genre.
All right.
I
Robert's
read everything.
our genre purist then. You can represent for the...
I did the whole English degree thing, so literary comes up.
Yep. Yeah. So I think literary fiction is the genre that defies genres, because you can have a work be literary and have thriller aspects or mystery aspects or, fantasy aspects. It can be literary hyphen, take your pick. Really, it's, I think with literary fiction, the author wants to tell a story and there's an emphasis on the prose. So the style is important. And then beyond that, whatever genre, whatever tropes or themes or settings are pertinent to that story is what you end up with, as opposed to genre fiction where you start with something like, outer space or medieval knights in armor or
a murder.
A murder, a body on the rug, or, a dark futuristic city. So what would you guys like to add to our working definition?
I always like to define literary by saying that it pushes the boxes.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever box you think that you're in, literary is going to expand that for you.
Right.
It's going to change your dynamic of looking at whatever it is you are looking at.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you can have literary fiction it's like literary science fiction or literary fantasy, like authors that are in that genre but can write very literary pieces because they're going to push the boundaries, whether that be with the character or the theme or anything like that.
Yeah, definitely.
I would say that I agree with your definition 100%, in that a literary book can have any other genre in it, and that there's a focus on a story being well told. But I'd add that a literary book has cultural significance, so that it addresses some broader topic that's not just, like for instance, if it's a fantasy, how do we win this magical war? Or if it's a sci-fi story, how do we, so I would say, like, one example that I love is Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein. Which is it's a commentary on politics and on human nature, and it's encased within this story about a human that grew up on Mars. So you could easily read it as a science fiction story, but the book is talking about so much more.
Right.
It's going to deal with things that make you think and kind of stick with you and make you think not necessarily about the story itself, but about the things that the story was wrestling with.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And also, if you read it within the context of the decade that it was written in, it makes even more sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
Because it is a lot to do with social mores and expectations and freedom from inhibition and all that kind of stuff that was going on in the 60s.
Right. All right. So far, our working definition is that literary fiction can cross over into any other genre, has a clear emphasis on prose and style. It pushes boundaries, has social and cultural significance, and Robert, you were just saying it's significant, it's relevant to its time. So the context of the period in which it was written or in which the author is living also has some significance, or potentially does. I think
literary novels do a lot, in other words.
I mean, you could also, and you can see why sometimes that sort of, it seems like a fairly sort of smug, grand definition. You can see why, we point to genre perhaps as genre readers who dislike or are anti-literary because it sounds like it's up itself. When at the end of the day, a good book is a good book, and so sometimes you can go and have fast food and it's fantastic. We know a lot of times it may not be, but there might be some place where you just love what they do, but then you'll go out for a gourmet meal and equally love it. So I do think it's a really hard one to pin down, isn't it? Because you can get stuck in trying to define what it is and then sound as if you're sort of saying it's something bigger, grander, and therefore better than genre-based fiction.
Right.
Right. Well, and I don't think it's better. I think we,
different.
Not speaking for the world at large, but we are not placing a value judgment there because we all write and read genre fiction as well as literary fiction. And I think that genre fiction can have social and cultural significance, and it can raise questions and all that as well, but maybe the style of it is not pushing the literary boundary, maybe the voice, the prose, so that might be where it stays in the genre camp instead of straddling that boundary between genre and literary.
So is there a question there about originality then?
That's actually a really good point. Because I was thinking of, I don't think we could list any of these things on air, but I was thinking about what is definitely not literary. And I think that at least for me, the main qualifier is that it's not original. So you think of sort of the like very, very tropey romances or very, very tropey sci-fi fantasy books that we see a lot of on Amazon, currently. I think that stuff might not be literary.
Yeah.
And I've had I've had people say about my sci-fi that it reminds them of space opera in the old tradition with the Heinlein, Asimov, and when I say Heinlein I don't mean his more literary works, and I'm fine with that because that's what I wanted to write was kind of space adventure. Right. But it's got some social commentary in it, but it's really not going to, it's not going to change anyone's mind. It's just going to be a fun story.
Right.
Your book's not going to end up on the burn list or anything.
Yeah. No. And I think we can add an element of difficulty to our qualifications. And again, there's a spectrum here. So as a reader engaging with the book, is it just a fun read, or am I being intellectually challenged in a good way, enjoying this process of intellectual challenge? Am I just like flipping pages and having a blast with this story, or am I really luxuriating in the beauty of the prose? So there's a difficulty, a language, a richness issue there. Am I just like being... so it's fun versus challenge.
Can I speed read? Can I speed read, or do I need every word in order to make it make sense?
Yeah, how much complexity and richness and difficulty, but in a good way, is there? So that would be another slider we can put between genre and literary fiction. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of books that I've really loved where that slider might be right in the middle, because the prose is fine quality, the story is excellent, but it's, it's really maybe a little more genre than literary because it's complex but not difficult, or, mm-hmm. So it's so subjective.
It really
is.
It
mm-hmm. is. How would you, if you think back to the last 10 books you read and say, well, in my mind, do I know which of those were literary? And then could I sit down and explain to somebody why? Mm-hmm. It's, as we say in a movie that you may never ever watch, but it's funny if you do, and Australian, it's called The Castle. It's a vibe thing, Your Honour, which is when one of the lawyers is defending a land grab, and he's a terrible lawyer, and he presents in the court, and the judge is questioning him, but so you're saying this, that, and the other, and he gets so frustrated, and he ends it, look, it's a vibe thing, Your Honour. Mm-hmm. And to me, literary is almost like that. It's almost as if you feel you've had a different experience from it that's not just something that's totally related or embedded in genre.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree that it's the experience of it.
So what would you do if you wanted to make a novel more literary when you're writing it? Like when, let's say this, you're not in your third edit, but let's say mm-hmm. you're planning a novel. What do you do to infuse it with to make it literary?
Well, I would focus on the characters so that the story is really about the experience of being a human being and having relationships. And within that, all sorts of other things can happen, murders and explosions and whatever you want, but the emphasis is not on the thrill ride. It's on the main character mm-hmm. and that emotional experience of being party to the thrill ride. And then I would put a lot of focus on tight prose and making the language a primary concern.
Notice tight, not purple.
Yes, exactly. Good point. Yes. Oh, purple prose.
But maybe that's why, voracious genre readers such as myself got put off literary, because mm-hmm. at school I hated English and I went on to study science. So mm-hmm. you can see why my bent is in science fiction because of that, probably. And so I can sometimes push back against literary because I don't want to read something that's really hard to read. Mm-hmm. And that's the impression. I know it's a perception thing, and it's probably because what you said, Alida, there was, I think, a really important syntax where in answering Mike's question, which is first and foremost, we're looking at the human experience, experienced vicariously through the character. So rather than just action beats and story and plot, we're starting to get deep into the human experience. And mm-hmm. you finished with, and then I would work on the prose.
Right.
Whereas the sort of concept of literary from a I'm holding up my quotes here, air quotes. The concept of literary from a genre reader's thing is, it's going to be that weird prose.
Mm-hmm. Weird.
Because maybe that's what I got thrown at school, and
right.
read this because it's sensational literature, and I read it and it's just difficult for me, and
right.
I didn't.
Right.
And so it doesn't have to be. It's not about the wording, it's about the experience again. So,
right,
yeah.
Right. Well, and what a lot of people had to read in school were classics or mm-hmm. older, early 20th century fiction and before. And so the language might seem a little stiff, formal, or archaic to us. So as a writer working today, you don't have to sound old-fashioned or archaic to write beautiful prose. It can be very contemporary in your syntax and your word choices, but you're still creating that tight story and visual descriptives and a sense of mood, So those mm-hmm. things add to the literary experience as well.
Right. We look at what we discussed in a previous episode in Foreshadowing, The Fight Club. Mm-hmm. Would you brand that as a literary novel?
Yeah, I would say he's a literary writer.
I would.
Chuck Palahniuk.
Mm-hmm. I would, because as I said at the time, it left me exhausted. Yeah. It was a ride.
Right. Right. Which is another great point, that just because something is literary doesn't mean it can't be a thrilling read.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but that book also pushes the envelope and is socially and culturally relevant and challenges you to think about a lot of issues as you go on this ride of, you know, men beating each other senseless in underground clubs and blowing up buildings.
Which you wouldn't necessarily think is, you know, a literary device.
Right. Well, and again, any story can be literary. It's that the plot does not exist for its own sake. The character moves through the plot, and that's what we're interested in. So, you know, people talk like character-driven story is a dirty word, but look at what a great example Fight Club is of a character-driven story that is also a thrill ride.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
So, Mike, what would you? I mean, I saw you were nodding vigorously there when it came to Fight Club being. Would you classify that as a literary novel? What would you say about it in terms of its literary value then?
Well, I would agree with Alita on all points on Chuck Palahniuk. I haven't read Fight Club as we talked about in the last one. So, but I have read other Chuck Palahniuk stuff.
Right. Okay.
But what I've been thinking about is what other examples I could give of books that are like are similar, where they're action packed or they're very engaging, you know, thrilling, and that are also qualified as literary. And I'm drawing a blank right this second, so if you could come back to me in like a minute.
Yeah.
Well, I brought in some examples. Did you guys bring examples?
We didn't bring, but it's in my mind.
Oh, show and tell here. All right. So one book, The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon, which won the Pulitzer. I mean, this is a big, fat literary novel, and It is full of Nazis and comic book superheroes and magicians and amazing escapes from Europe, immigration, there's so much going on in this book, and definitely literary, definitely thrilling. And then it spawned like comic books, because the main characters start a comic book company. So there were spin-offs off of this, of like comic books of what these guys invented in this story and all that kind of stuff. So definitely action-packed, intriguing, you know.
I actually, could I stick to
totally.
it? So Frankenstein and Dracula, they're both horror, they're both monster books, and they both have a lot of gore and incest and all sorts of stuff.
Right.
And they are unquestionably literary because both of those characters talk about something that's very human. In the case of Dracula, it's lust and desire, and in the case of Frankenstein, it's what it means to be created, and you know, what is a god and what is a what is a child and a parent, and the responsibility between. So those two.
Yeah, and Frankenstein is also science fiction because of the whole laboratory and the cadavers, and this was hot topics at the time that Mary Shelley wrote this book in the 1790s. You know, there were questions of the ability to reanimate life, and there were shows traveling around, like rich people would bring them to their house parties where somebody would put like an electric shock into a animal or whatever, and the leg would jerk, and so people thought this was reanimation, that this was life and such. So, as Robert was saying about being a product of its time, of the author's time, and then that social and political context and commentary being so important and pushing the envelope. I mean, huge issues of morality and science and religion, you know, in Frankenstein. It's a great example.
Yeah, great examples, yeah. So it's interesting, isn't it, that they both have got elements of genre within them, but the ultimate difference is that they answer a bigger question if the reader wants that, in that you don't necessarily have to have that experience, but it's there. And I guess the mistake that you could make as an author is going back through, like Mike was saying, if I want to make it more literary, the mistake you could make is going back, okay, well, I better have a preachy theme in here that I need to smack the reader over the head with.
Oh, God, no.
No, and so when we say something is literary, it does that so eloquently and elegantly that you really don't notice.
Right.
Or at least, no, that's not saying that much. You don't notice that it completely fits with the story, and you don't ever feel that the author is talking to you.
Mm-hmm. I would say that there is an argument being made by the book that you can take both sides and see both sides through the book, and that they present the full picture for you to then gnaw on.
Yeah.
There's not that preachy quality because they're not giving you one thing that they're saying, this is the truth that we are presenting in this book. They're saying, here is this massive thing,
right? And
now take it, think about it, chew on it. Here's a story that wraps around it that makes you think about it, chew on it, and sort of come to a realization about yourself or the people around you.
Right. And that's that difficulty piece, that intellectual challenge that you get, intellectual, moral, emotional, whatever notes that book is hitting. Totally.
So by that definition, then, I suppose the Bible is not literary, it's genre.
I think it depends on the reader on that one.
We won't go there.
I'm not going there.
Yeah, let's not. Thanks.
But it does pose a question. Very good.
Yeah. The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver. This is one of my favorites. I think I've read this 3 times. Historical 1960s, I think. Something was just shot into space. I don't remember if it was, a dog or a chimp or if we went to the moon. But it was somebody went into space at the opening time of this book. But a family goes to the Congo. 1960. That's what it was. A monkey barreled through space in an American rocket. So family goes to the Congo as missionaries because the father is a religious, a minister, but also something of a zealot. And they live in this little village in the Congo. And there's so many issues here of culture and colonization and religion and, the ethics of conversion and cultural egotism. So, definitely a compelling, gripping read, but socially and culturally important. And literary. All right. So I brought in Saturday just because I always screw up Ian McEwan's name. Ian McKellen, Ewan McGregor, Ian McEwan. So this one is like a thriller story of, a home invasion with life and death stakes, but it's very literary. It's very human driven, following this one guy through 24 hours when his life goes awry. So
you have to read that one. That sounds good.
And beautiful prose, very descriptive. So there you go. And then, The Great Gatsby and To Kill a Mockingbird, we looked at in the foreshadowing episode a little bit. And just in case people want to look up some of the stuff, Drowned by Junot Diaz, those are short stories. They're amazing. Drinking Coffee Elsewhere by ZZ Packer, another great collection of short stories. I brought in Where No Gods Came by Sheila O'Connor, who's actually one of my professors from Hamlin. But this has a young protagonist, so it's a literary novel, and I would say marketed toward adults based on the cover and the style of it, but also a YA coming-of-age story, So, just, it can be any genre you want, but it's literary.
Right.
I can see Catherine already thinking, show notes, man.
I was going to say,
so many books.
I think I've linked to both the Poisonwood Bible and Saturday like maybe a dozen times both. So
a dozen.
Oh, okay.
We mentioned those a lot.
Saturday, we mentioned a lot.
Okay, well, I really have to read that then.
Yeah. Well, the Poisonwood Bibles may be my favorite, and I don't know why I keep going back to Saturday.
I struggled to find examples, mostly because, as I said, I'm a voracious genre reader, and so that's what I've been doing a lot of lately. So I kind of had to sort of search back and think what books stayed with me that weren't just genre that I could single out. And I don't even know if you would say these are literary. One of them is by John Fowles, The Magus, which is a brilliant coming of age story, but it's really it's a young guy who it turns out that everything he thought about what was important in life is wrong. And it just caught me at a time in my life where I needed to read something like that. And it changed my life. It really did. It's just think differently. And
nice.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it was necessarily anything spectacular prose-wise or even plot-wise, but when you come to it, it's your point about character, I guess. I put myself in his shoes, and it was a very interesting turnaround of events. And the other one, which you'd definitely say isn't probably known as a literary example, but again, the Dice Man, which I think is another book that also helped me change my outlook on life, and it's certainly not written in a literary fashion, but again, it's about, I guess, the character's experience from what happens if you decide to make your life controlled by the roll of a dice, as opposed to and it ends up being quite serious, but starts out frivolously. I don't know, I can't decide what to eat today. I don't know, I'll just assign 3 different choices to, between 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 on a dice, and that'll make it for me. And then it's so exhilarating that he doesn't have to make decisions anymore, that he goes on to use it for some huge decisions. And, but it's quite a fast-paced read, and I would say it's quite pulpy. Yeah, it left an imprint on me.
Interesting.
So I don't, is literary in the eye of the beholder? Is it? Do you think? I don't know.
It's a spectrum. I mean, to a certain degree, yes, but to a certain degree, no, because I think we've already listed a lot of objective qualifications of literary fiction. But then, as we've said, there's that spectrum. And, I've got plenty of books on my bookshelves I chose not to bring because they're kind of straddling that divide. They're a little closer to genre than these books are that I brought in as examples.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So I suppose it comes back to posing that bigger question for the reader, that if you want to read into it, that it's there for you, as opposed to being rammed down your throat or whatever.
Yeah. Definitely.
Or the opposite, not present. I actually, the more I've thought about your qualifier that it should be relevant to the time that it was created in, I think that's a really great marker, especially in sci-fi and fantasy, where you're off world. I think that if you're able to draw parallels to the real world, that one, that makes a book so much more rich, and 2, I think that it absolutely is a great way to find the literary merit.
Yes. Yeah, well said.
That's a really good point.
So, for instance, the recent version of Battlestar Galactica is an excellent example. I mean, that's a thrill right off the way, but it's a major commentary on the nature of faith and politics and community.
Yeah, I've noticed in film and TV recently, and I don't know how many years back these shows go, but not that many, but like Extant and Humans, and there's a lot of concern right now about artificial intelligence and androids becoming so human-like that we can't really tell them apart from ourselves, and aliens coming and mixing in with humans again in such a way with the technology, and that kind of lines are being blurred between humanity and not humanity. So there is something that's culturally relevant today that's sort of in the air that we're seeing play out in our art, in our storytelling.
Right.
Yeah, exactly right.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if those shows are literary. They aren't fiction. They aren't written. They are fiction. They aren't written. But just what you said about that being a good benchmark for science fiction and fantasy is that relevance to today's culture.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I always loved about science fiction from reading from an early age, was it made me think about how society might change if this invention became prevalent, or if this new method of travel changed the way that we interacted with one another. And you could argue that the advent of the internet, for example, and the fact that we're all talking together now and we span the entire globe right at this very moment in time was something that I only read about when I was growing up as a kid. And that has changed the way that we communicate and the way that we interact and political narrative. So I think that's a good point. If you want to get into that with sci-fi or with fantasy, then a lot of authors have expressed that as part of the joy of writing that, is that you can draw parallels without necessarily naming the current president, for example, or without offending people because you're naming specific religious faiths, for example. So you can be allegorical.
Definitely. All right. Any other examples anyone wants to bring up of literary fiction? Anything you want to share? Any other thoughts about what makes...
Don't be scared of it.
Yeah, people enjoy it. Go read some good literary fiction and have fun with the challenge.
Don't let the people who do the literary criticism scare you. Don't let the idea that you have to read too much into it scare you. Like, just go enjoy a really good story.
Yeah, that's the thing I think that I can take away from this, is that, I've probably been put off by the whole prize-winning thing, and then tried to read some of those books and just been really turned off. And maybe because the judges have taken a certain aspect of it, they've scored it on prose, or they've scored it on high concept and not necessarily on the delivery of that concept.
Well, and again, though, like, if you know what kind of reader you are, don't choose a literary book that fits into none of your, like, that doesn't push any buttons for you. Like, come on. Like, if you really love, that adventure, there are literary novels.
Fine literary adventures,
Exactly.
Yeah.
And who knows, you might already be reading literary books. You just
aren't aware of it. Right. Okay, just quickly to that point, Ian McEwan, Saturday, Booker Prize winning author of Amsterdam and Atonement. So here's the prose we're dealing with. Damage from the small vessel clotting tends to accumulate in the white matter and destroy the mind's connectivity. Along the way, well before the process is complete, Lily is able to deliver her rambling treatises, her nonsense monologues with touching seriousness. She doesn't doubt herself at all, nor does she think that he's unable to follow her. The structure of her sentences is intact, and the moods which inflect her various descriptions make sense. It pleases her if he nods and smiles and chimes in from time to time. So I picked that paragraph at random, so as an excerpt it maybe isn't like exciting, but but you can see just the syntax, the word choice, the sentence structure. It's not archaic. It's not slow. It's not a slogging read.
It's modern day. No.
Yes.
Yeah.
Literary does not mean you have to go pick up Dostoevsky.
Right.
Just saying. Although those novels are fantastic. Also, just saying.
All right, put them in the show notes. Okay, that has been another episode of Storyworks Roundtable. Thank you so much for listening, and please subscribe, rate, and review us. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.